Oh, happy Thursday, everybody, and welcome into GC Live Afternoon Drive. It is January 11th, 2024, and what a wild last, probably I'd even say 18 hours, really, with the news both in college football, of course, in the SEC, with Nick Saban announcing his retirement after 17 seasons at the helm in Alabama, and, of course, the news that transpired today in the NFL with Bill Belichick as he part ways with the New England Patriots at the 24 season. So I know, hey, look, this is a South Carolina show, but I think those two things in particular, especially when you're talking about two of the greatest at their profession, when you're talking about football, whether it be at the college ranks, whether it be the professional ranks, that is certainly something I know a lot of people are paying attention to today, and it certainly is going to steal the headlines all over sports talk radio and television. You guys want to talk about that at all? Feel free. We'll get into that a little bit later in the program. Having said all that, as it's been all offseason, it feels like with South Carolina, a lot more moving pieces for the Gamecocks. We are sitting here today, a couple months away until spring practices begin. We're a couple months away until the spring game itself. And the reason why I bring those two things up is there's certain things that South Carolina still needs to address before we get to spring practices. Certainly, they've been able to add another quarterback in that room, preferred walk-on. We'll get into that in just a little bit. One that has ties to the state of South Carolina, grew up here, Greenville. So we'll get into that as well. But there's also other things, too, that the Gamecocks need to do before they get into spring practices. And I'll explain what those things are in a little bit. Plus, if you are a subscriber on Gamecock Central, you saw a story that I shared today that talked about one that has not been a public story until today, and that was a story between Shane Beamer and Bill Belichick. And I shared that today, of course, with everything that took place today with Belichick. So if you haven't had a chance to hear that story, I will share that later on in the show. Having said all that, when I look at where South Carolina is right now, there's a couple things that I feel like they need to continue to do. Certainly, they need to continue to look at adding depth into that quarterback room. Yes, being able to bring in a extra body to have right now in the spring, it's great, but at the same time too, I still feel like you need to be able to bring in one more quarterback on scholarship. Now, we've shared this before. South Carolina, as of today, and these numbers that we use over on Gamecock Central, and I'll open it up for any of you that aren't familiar with it, and I would highly suggest adding this into your favorites because it's a great tab to have when we're talking about South Carolina and where they're at from a scholarship standpoint. But we have a running list of where USC stands with their scholarships. But it's also important to keep in mind that this is a projected number for the fall. So I'm going to share this with you guys so you guys can see what this looks like. So here we are. Now, South Carolina, again, they are one over the 85 scholarship limit. At this point, it's not something to really worry about right now because in most cases, if not all cases, it always feels like it just takes care of itself. And like I said, when you scroll down and you see that number, 86, one over the 85 limit, this is projected for the fall. So some of these players aren't here yet. You think of a guy like Matthew Fuller. There's obviously a bunch of 2024 players who've already enrolled as early enrollees. But there's also some players still part of that 2024 class that aren't here yet. So that's why, again, you see that number. So not to get too caught up and worried about this and that. So, but that just to explain it a little bit. So that's why when you look at this list, this is just scholarship players. So yesterday, what South Carolina was able to do, they were able to add a preferred walk-on, Davis Beville. And I'm going to show you guys Davis. See, share this tab. So this is Davis. He's coming from Oklahoma. And the thing with South Carolina, again, as I mentioned before, I still feel like they need to add one more quarterback that's there from a scholarship standpoint. And that's no disrespect to Davis, but being able to add someone in there that can really I don't know. And I'm not saying Davis can't go in there and compete. All the luck to him, right? But being able to really push Sellers, Reno, and he might be able to do that. I mean, it would be a phenomenal story if he's able to come in here and compete. That's great. Beville spent 3 seasons of his college career at Pittsburgh before transferring to Oklahoma in 2022. Over his career, he has completed 37 of 62 passes for 339 yards. He has thrown 1 touchdown and 2 interceptions. Stands at 6'6", 226 pounds. He attended Greenville High School before joining the Panthers. He was rated as the 41st quarterback in his class and the 6th best prospect from the state of South Carolina for the class of 2019, writes my co-worker, Chris Clark. So that's to give you guys an idea on who Davis is. But going back to the scholarship standpoint, that's why you don't see him in there, because he's a preferred walk-on. When you look at what South Carolina has ahead of Sellers, and of course Reno's there as a true freshman, you don't have experience in that room. And even bringing in this guy, Beville, not a lot of experience there from a production standpoint. Obviously, he's been in college for a while, and he's going to be able to bring that element to it. We know Luke Doty's there, even though Doty's going to be working more so with the wide receivers. I've said this before. As far as Gamecock returning wide receivers, Doty is your most productive wideout returning. Had 13 catches last season. So, yes, he has experience of playing quarterback. Yes, we know with Doty, it doesn't matter who is in which room, right? Quarterback, wide receiver, whatever the case may be. Doty's going to do whatever he can to help the team. We know that. We know he's going to help out guys like Sellers and Reno and even this preferred walk-on coming in. He's going to do whatever he can to help the team. But certainly when you look at the wide receiver room, he's going to be helping out a lot of younger players in that room too. You look at what South Carolina has on the scholarship standpoint from wide receivers. They've been able to add a couple talented guys, and they feel is going to be able to compete, not just for starting spots, but they're going to be able to also compete and add some depth in positions that South Carolina certainly needs. So when I look at, again, from a wide receiver from a quarterback standpoint, I would like to see USC add one more piece to that, a preferred scholarship guy, I would say. But where they are, at least today, at least they have more bodies in that room. Because the reality is, if they weren't able to add at least one more quarterback before spring practices begin, realistically, you're looking at just 2 quarterbacks, with Doty also getting in some work there, but he'd probably have to get in some more work with the quarterbacks simply because you just wouldn't have had the bodies to be able to do so. And if you're doing that, it's going to take away from what it sounds like, from not just what Shane Beamer talked about on early National Signing Day, which was just over 3 weeks ago, but from my talks with people in that building and people around the program, it sounds like Doty's going to be working more and more with the wide receiver unit than anything else. I would dub it more so as an emergency quarterback from the way people have described it to me. Because, yes, I understand what he did last year, but it sounds like they're going to slowly start to get away from it. But, again, he'll get some work at quarterback. But having said all that, if you were down to just 2 scholarship quarterbacks, not including Doty, then you would have needed to be able to throw someone in there if you didn't have this preferred walk-on coming in there. Having said that, you look at the wide receiver situation. Gage Lavendane coming in. And he was a high priority target for South Carolina shortly after he entered the portal. Ranking him a 4-star on 3. The number 12 receiver and number 48 overall prospect in the transfer portal. 5'10", 165. Yes, not the biggest guy, but despite his size, as my co-worker Wes Mitchell wrote, he has quickness, speed, good hands when it comes to ball skills. He's a proven downfield threat, deep speed, and that's something certainly that South Carolina needs when you're talking about losing a guy like Juice Wells And when you're talking about replacing a guy like Xavier Leggett. So we can sit here today and we can say, all right, realistically, when you look at that room, who will be your number one guy? I don't think Nick Harbor's ready to be a number one yet. And if you guys feel otherwise, let me know. If you agree with me, let me know. Share your thoughts, and we'll share some of these thoughts on the program. I really think you're looking at a guy like Jared Brown or one of these new additions from the transfer portal, whether it be Gage or whether it be the transfer from Miami of Ohio, who we'll talk about in a little bit. But you need to be able to find someone to stretch the field. Huggins Bruce, he did some good things at Louisville. He's another guy to keep an eye on. 3 seasons there, 80 catches, over 1,100 yards and 10 touchdowns. But as I mentioned with Laverdane from Miami of Ohio, he's someone that I could see competing for a spot as well. But again, these are guys that when I look at it from a body standpoint size, you're thinking more slot. But we'll see. I mean, this is where South Carolina just realistically is right now. This is where they are realistically. All right, let's take a look at some of the comments, questions, concerns, anything else. William goes, maybe get Daniel Hill. I added this part today in my piece on Gamecock Central on Quick Slants, the weekly Thursday column. If you're not a GC subscriber, sign up today, just $1 for the first month. Alabama's still Alabama, with Nick Saban, without Nick Saban, at least in the short term. Historically, when you look at that name, Alabama, they have one of the richest traditions in all of college football. The biggest question now as we transition into this new era of college football with NIL, with the transfer portal, with Nick Saban moving on now, will Alabama start to see at least players, whether it be this 2024 class, whether it be players that are currently on the roster, will we start to slowly see players leave? I think short-term wise, I don't think it will be this big exodus because I still think, like I said, I still think Alabama will be a very, very good program. But the question now becomes, how many of those players that committed to Alabama are going to look at it just a little bit differently? I know that might sound funny to say, but at the same time, too, is it really that far off to believe that? Because when you think about it, a lot of players wanted to commit to Alabama. Obviously, if you're not from the state, there's a different feeling, certainly if you're from the state of Alabama. But a lot of them wanted to play for Nick Saban. What he was able to do in terms of development and being able to get them ready for the next level. Again, I'm not saying that players like all of a sudden this team's going to just fall apart. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think this is still going to be a very good Alabama team next year. My question now becomes, if we do see players enter the portal, decommit in a situation like potentially Daniel Hill, and that's not to say that Daniel Hill is even thinking about that right now, but it's certainly something that you'd be crazy and naive not to just think of. How much of this happens over the next, say, week, couple months, a year from now, 2 years from now, especially with these transfer portal rules, where players can enter the portal a year from now, 2 years from now, even if they have already entered once or twice. Now, when a coach leaves, a player has the ability to leave at any given time. That's why with the transfer portal being closed, it doesn't really make that much of a difference right now for Alabama. If their players want to enter the portal, they can do that. And I don't know if there's a perfect answer to say when should Saban have stepped down, because you look at the window. And so I bring that up just from an ethical standpoint. I don't think there's much that you can really do. And I don't really blame him from when he stepped down. I don't think there's a perfect time by any means. But having said all that, it will be interesting to just monitor what Daniel Hill does. Certainly South Carolina has done a phenomenal job this offseason with being able to add plenty of talented players in that running back room. You think about just being able to land Rocket Sanders, Oscar Attaway, to go along with Juju McDowell that's already back, and Juju, of course, coming back from breaking his collarbone towards the end of last season. On top of that, you have DJ Braswell, who I was very impressed by Very impressed by this past season in his limited action. And unfortunately for Braswell, because of playing in, I think it was 5 games, if I'm not mistaken, because he played in 5 games, he wasn't able to preserve his red shirt. Juwan Howell from South Carolina State, another talented back that South Carolina was able to pick up. And as I shared on Gamecock Central a couple weeks ago when he committed to South Carolina, from talking to a coach over at SC State, he compared him to what Najee Harris was able to do during his Alabama days. That's how talented he believes Howell is. So I bring those things up because we haven't even talked about the addition of Matthew Fuller, who had a phenomenal senior season, had a great career. But this past year, that's why it skyrocketed him up to being ranked number 11th by On3, going from a 3-star to a 4-star. Where does Daniel Hill factor in? Because we look at these running backs right here, and I think Daniel Hill's obviously a very talented back, and I'm sure a lot of you do too. But when you look at what South Carolina has been able to add, both through the portal and obviously being able to add a guy like Matthew Fuller, never mind the fact that you have already some talented pieces in there like Braswell, where does Hill factor in? And if a guy like Hill were to come here and he doesn't get his touches right away, are you able to keep him here? I mean, this is just the reality of college football where we are today in 2024. Craig says, yo, Mike. Yo, Craig. Clinton says he will probably go to Mississippi State. It's going to be something to keep an eye on. I don't know if it will happen right away because, like we said, could always go to Bama one year, enters the portal the next, goes to Mississippi State, goes somewhere else for all we know. South Carolina, I don't know. But it's something certainly to pay attention to if you enjoy following the portal and high school recruiting, because National Signing Day, we're a couple weeks away from the second signing day period. They'll be coming up on the first Wednesday of February. Craig says, Clint, long time. How you been? WJM41 says, wow, 6'6". Yes, that is talking about, you were talking about the new quarterback, Davis Beville, that the Gamecocks were able to pick up a preferred walk-on from Oklahoma. Also spent some time at Pittsburgh, where he committed to from the class of 2019 out of Greenville High School. Robert Doug Hill says, what about Mike Wright, the Vanderbilt quarterback who transferred to Mississippi State? What about him, Robert? Anything in particular? WJM4, can he catch? Need one more. Yeah, I mean, just going down the list from some of the wide receivers that we talked about, I think that's the thing that worries me the most when we look at, I mean, outside of the lack of experience at quarterback. And I've said this before, Sellers could be the next best thing. That's great. It's just that, you're banking on something that you just haven't been able to see yet in a game, and he's not any different from any other quarterback that has come in, whether it be a freshman, sophomore, redshirt freshman, someone that you just haven't seen enough. I mean, he could come out there week one and he could tear it up. We're going to have to wait and see. But having said all that, quarterback aside, you'd love to be able to add some more weapons in that in that wide receiver room. I think South Carolina's strongest point right now outside of the running back room, certainly starts with their running back room, is their offensive line, which for the last couple of years, it's been pretty beat up. Now, it's not even specifically even talking about the injuries. It's been beat up. But Beamer and this coaching staff, they've done a tremendous job of rebuilding that offensive line room. 16 scholarship players on the offensive line heading into 2024. Wrote a piece yesterday on Gamecock Central. We'll talk about that in a little bit and why I believe the offensive line is, I've been covering the Gamecocks since 2016. This is the deepest room that I can remember. And they've produced some guys that have gone on to the NFL, as many of you are aware. But I would say this is the deepest, at least on paper, that the offensive line room has looked like in my tenure of covering the Gamecocks. That's for sure. Let's keep on moving. We got here. Cocky Joe says, what's up, Gamecocks? Adam Davis, you could just have a bunch of walk-ons and pay for their schooling with NIL, right? I don't know all the rules when it comes to that, Adam, but I'm sure that you're not the first that has. Certainly, you're not the first person that has brought that up to us. Um, I don't know how you would necessarily maneuver that, but I also don't know if that's legal in the sense of, okay, we do this and that. I mean, obviously, if you're able to give a player X amount of money, and I'm sure that there are cases out there that's happening, whether it's legal or not, that's a different story. But I think it's difficult to put it this way. I've had conversations with some coaches. When I say coaches, I'm not specifically just talking about South Carolina coaches. I'm talking about college coaches. And they've had situations where they've wanted to do exactly what you're talking about, but the player and the player's family, it left them unease. And in some cases, they had a scholarship the year before. They may have had a scholarship for 4 years. And now that we're getting into the COVID years, now that we're getting into some guys that are 6 years, right? Some of these guys, when they're going into that 5th year, that 6th year, even in some cases, the 7th year, coaches are trying to figure out from a mathematical standpoint how to make their scholarships work. And in some cases, I've heard situations where they've tried to maneuver things, talking about NIL and being able to help things out. Now, again, is that legal? But it certainly has gone on from some of the conversations I've had with people in the college football world. Cocky Joe says, still need a wide receiver 1. Craig goes, Nick, speaking about Nick Harbor. Nick has a long way to go. I think Glaverdane may be the guy. Lola son says, hey, Mike, just got on. Any updates on the running back coach? We will, we'll get into the running back coach in a little bit because I think that is a good question, Lola, and that will bring me down into a little, I wouldn't say rabbit hole of things, but I definitely want to take a deeper look into that because my colleague Chris Clark put out something yesterday from Gamecock Central saying that we are coming closer to the end, or it appears to be coming that way. And we could be finding out who South Carolina's next running backs coach is sooner rather than later. So we will get into that shortly because I think we're in a position right now where I could see it happening by tomorrow, but it could also drag into next week before we have the announcement. But I think we are coming very, very close to the end. That's what it appears to be based on what Chris has heard, based on what I've heard. I haven't talked to Wes about it today or yesterday afternoon, but from our conversations, I mean, all three of us were constantly texting each other, calling each other, trying to figure out what's going on, sharing information between one another to confirm and kind of add and build on some of the other things that one of us may have heard. But that's kind of where we are. So we'll talk about the running back situation in a little bit so I can give you more information on that. Lauren says, I really think it really depends on who they hire. And I think you're talking about the Alabama situation. Craig goes, Bama already lost the number 1 receiver in this year's class. James goes, with Saban leaving and already seeing players recommit, I think he meant decommit, and are now going into the portal, does Shane get more aggressive in the spring portal? Well, again, James, when you look at where South Carolina is from a scholarship standpoint, even though I said in a sense that the scholarship count is crap, at the same time, too, you're going to have to get down to that 85 mark. So, yes, as of today, the projected number for the fall is 86 scholarships. Heading into spring practices, South Carolina will be either at 86 or if they add a quarterback, and I don't anticipate them adding really any more players from the portal before that. They could. It's always a possibility. Portal as far as a scholarship standpoint goes. But if they do, right, the projected number goes up, whether it be 87, 88, whatever the case may be. Always, always, always remember that following spring practices, and this will not be just limited to South Carolina because it's going to happen throughout college football. And this isn't me saying, all right, Mike knows something, but there's going to be players that will enter the portal after spring practices. whether that be at South Carolina, whether that be at other schools throughout the country, simply because when you have your end of the year meeting, whether it be with the coordinator, even the head coach or positional coach, whatever the case may be, and you're laying out what your plans are for the following season, and they lay out what they view you to be to them in the next season, in this case, the 2024 year, or even a little bit beyond, some of those players will go through spring practices and they'll see the writing on the wall. And that writing on the wall tells them, okay, the expectations I have for this upcoming year, or potentially even further, if they get beat out by a guy that is an early enrollee, wherever the case may be, they might be further back in the depth chart. And they might look at that and say, you know what? I don't like my chances here. You know what? I don't like what's going on here for whatever case, right? And they decide to enter the portal. Certainly that will free up some spots from a scholarship standpoint. It happens every year. But especially now more than ever when we're talking about the transfer portal. So that's something I would keep an eye on, that there could be, again, some additional players that will enter the portal. And if they do, South Carolina, I'm sure, is keeping an eye on that. Now, what typically happens is, and this isn't saying like verbatim of what South Carolina is doing, but from my conversations with different coaches across the country, when you're talking about that specific situation that I just brought up, they already have an idea of some of the players who could potentially do that. In some cases, not every case, but in some cases. And they're already thinking ahead as to, okay, if this player leaves, that could free up a scholarship. But okay, not only does it free up a scholarship, but how is our situation at linebackers? How is our situation at cornerback, defensive line, whatever the case may be? So they're always thinking ahead as to where they might have to replace someone if, God forbid, someone were to enter the portal. Again, it doesn't always work out that way, but you see some of the cases what South Carolina has been able to do this cycle, right? You look at the running back situation, and again, that's not to say that this is exactly how it worked out for every position with every player, but notice how quickly South Carolina was able to reload at running back. Notice how quickly they were able to reload at the linebacker position when certain players enter the portal. It doesn't always happen, but I feel like South Carolina has done a very good job with both those positions, and I'm sure a lot of people would agree. But just notice how quickly it happened, because they were ready for a lot of that to happen. Certainly when you look at the running back situation, it wasn't, outside of Mario Anderson, it wasn't like guys were entering the portal left and right. They just didn't have any bodies really in there, right? But they also knew that with Daniel Hill, he could have been dragging it on. Okay, he's not going to make his commitment now until January 4th. Well, guess what they do? They decide to go ahead and bring in some guys, and they're not going to play this waiting game, which, as I've shared before, you go back to last season trying to be able to bring in the running back from Notre Dame who eventually commits to LSU, try to go out there and get another running back. Well, guess what? He goes somewhere else because you wasted more time on Diggs, who eventually committed to LSU. Now, ironically, he's also back in the portal. Can't wait. And I think that's what South Carolina has done a really good job of. Kendall says, can Bama do us a favor and hire Dabo? It would be funny. And I say funny in the sense that it would just be interesting to hear everything coming out of Clemson if that were to happen. Cocky Joe says, hope Shane goes and gets the best players he can. I pull for the team, not individual players anymore. Yeah, in a lot of ways, you're just cheering for the cloth, right? Whatever jersey they're wearing. I don't know if it was trying to remember the comedian. I think it may have been Bill Burr who was saying that essentially you're just cheering for cloth, or it may have been Jerry Seinfeld back in the day that said it. And that's kind of where it is right now. Whether you like where the direction of college sports are going or not, it's kind of just how it is now. Lee Hopkins says, Mike, when you have a second, can you speak on the offensive line, what your gut feeling on how things are going? Thanks. Yeah, let's get into that in a minute, Lee. I'm going to also put that one to the side. We'll get back. Oscar Adaway Jr., the father of Oscar Adaway III. Good to have you back on air. Any updates on the running back? Coach, I'm sorry, I just got on here. No worries, Oscar. Again, thank you for hopping on. Gamecock fans, be sure to welcome Oscar and his father. Looking forward to being, like as I told you earlier, Mr. Adaway, looking forward to covering your son. Let's get into it. Let's get into the running back situation, huh? Running back coach situation. Where we sit right now, and I just got to your question, so you may have heard a little bit of what I said. Oscar. But as you submitted this question at 2:26, and I'm just getting to it now as I scroll down the list of questions and comments. It looks like we're getting closer to the end of an announcement coming out, which I'm sure for your son and the other running backs in that room, they just want to know who their coach is going to be, right? So the names that we've been told to keep an eye on. I reported over the weekend on Gamecock Central, Newland Isaac. I know that you heard me say that the other day when you tuned in, so we appreciate you tuning in on Tuesday. That's the running back coach from Liberty. Jimmy Smith, who also has ties to South Carolina. Both Newland and Jimmy both have ties from South Carolina. Jimmy Smith was at Arkansas. He's a name that we've been told to keep an eye on. Matt Merritt from University of Southern Florida. And the other name to keep an eye on, which would be a reunion, because Thomas Brown was here, but Thomas Brown from the Carolina Panthers. The more we get closer to this end, there's been a lot of buzz with all those guys. With Isaac in particular, I'd say there's been the most buzz going back to Saturday. When I reported the news Saturday night going into Sunday morning on Gamecock Central. If it is indeed Isaac, I really, really like some of the things that he's been able to do throughout his career. And the reason why I say that is when you look at what he's been able to accomplish throughout his coaching career, he's someone that has come from the bottom in a lot of ways. He was coaching at the Division II ranks, and he worked his way up. And Oscar, I'm sure you would agree with this, as your son makes the jump from the Mean Green and coming on over to South Carolina. And as I know, being a Division II guy, there's a lot of talent at some of these smaller schools, whether it be coaches, whether it be players. I'm not saying that I would have done anything at South Carolina, I promise you that. But my whole point being is they have a chip on their shoulder, and I'm sure your son has a chip on his shoulder as he comes to South Carolina. I shared some of this the other day, may have been on Sunday, on Intern Joe's show, The Walkthrough, but just to share a little bit of background on Isaac. North Greenville, Delta State, a powerhouse Division II school. I had a chance to cover them in 2015. Charleston Southern, his alma mater, where he walked on. Albany State, he was an assistant head coach, offensive coordinator. Goes to Coastal Carolina. Obviously, Coastal Carolina under Jamie Chadwell, going into the FBS ranks. Phenomenal job. Running backs coach for 1 year. The following 4 seasons, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, co-offensive coordinator and running backs coach at Coastal. And then this past season at Liberty, co-offensive coordinator and running backs coach. An undefeated Liberty team in the regular season. And I shared some of this. I know you may have heard me say this the other day, Oscar. The Flames led the conference with over 4,000 yards rushing. That was 1,000 yards more than the second leading rushing team in the conference. They produced 2,000-yard backs. And I say 2,000-yard backs loosely because that second one was a quarterback. But those two guys led the conference with their leading running back. Cooley led the conference with over 1,400 yards rushing. Here's the other part about Isaac. He was named the 2021 AFCA FBS Assistant Coach of the Year by the American Football Coaches Association. That's where you get the AFCA. So I bring those things up because he has a tremendous, tremendous resume. And since we've been talking about him over the last couple of days, really going back to Saturday, he is someone that I think a lot more people are getting excited about. When you go back, there's one clip in particular, and I'm sure you could just find this on YouTube. Liberty did like an all-access, mic'd up thing with him. And we see that with coaches, right? But the interesting thing about him is just listening to the way he teaches. And I'm paraphrasing, but what he mentioned specifically is he likes to get in the heads of players. They go out there, they do something, and he'll explain, he'll ask them, hey, what did you see? Instead of just saying, all right, no, do it this way. He wants to find out why they did it a certain way. And that's not saying that he's the only coach that does it that way. But he's someone that understands, by being a former player, by being a walk-on at that, by being someone that played at Charleston Southern, working his way up, he understands, too, how to coach players. And every player is different. I mean, you're talking about over 100 players. You're talking about over 100 players. So I think, and we're talking about 100 players, we're talking not specific about a running back room, much smaller. But when you're talking about football, 100 players, 100 different personalities. You're not going to be able to coach everyone the same way, just like you're not going to be able to coach every running back the same way. And I'm sure in that running back room, there's going to be a bunch of different personalities. And I think he understands that. So I'm excited to see what South Carolina ultimately does with their running back hire. But again, that is something that we're continuing to monitor is Isaac from Liberty, to go along with those three other coaches I mentioned. But I think this should be something that will get done, if not by tomorrow, at the beginning of next week, because they want to get things going. They want to get things going from everyone that I've spoke with, as well as what my colleagues Chris Clark and Wes Mitchell have heard. So that also hopefully answers your question, Lola, about the running back situation. Let's see. Now let's go into what Lee was talking about. And hopefully Lee's still on here to be able to hear the answer to what you were asking, Lee. Lee asked a little bit earlier, and we'll share it again. Mike, when you have a second, can you speak on the offensive line? What's your gut feeling on how things are going? I said this yesterday in my piece, and I'll kind of recap it here today on the program, that when you look at South Carolina's offensive line and where they stand today based on, from a paper standpoint, right? Early breakdown in South Carolina's 2024 offensive line room. You have 16 scholarship players that are expected to be here. Now, the reason I say expected is because, and this isn't to say Mike knows something, someone's going to leave, but as I alluded to before, there's always the possibility of someone entering the portal after spring practices. And that, of course, can happen at any given time, but I wouldn't be shocked to see a player or two, whether it be here, whether it be at other schools. That's going to happen. It's going to happen. People look at the numbers game sometimes, right? So I say that because when I look at South Carolina's offensive line room now in comparison to last year, never mind the injuries, put the injuries aside, I felt like South Carolina had talent on the offensive line. However, I also felt like there was going to be a lot of question marks with that offensive line room. So much so, and I went back and I found an old story that I wrote from a year ago. So much so that I remember writing a story. I'm going to bring it up here, and I'll kind of mention some of the things I said. But I specifically talked about why I felt like the offensive line room was going to be a big, I don't want to just say question mark. It was going to be a weakness for South Carolina. Now, again, talented players on that O-line. Injuries certainly didn't help, but it was going to be a big question mark simply because there wasn't a lot of proven talent. And never mind proven talent, but you just didn't have the same type of depth, certainly, as you have coming back in what you're looking at this season. So I say those things as I pull up South Carolina's offensive line room. The big thing that hurt South Carolina from 2022 heading into 2023, they lost more than 50% of the starts from their offensive line. If you add up, and if some of you may remember this from a story I did with Gamecock Central last year, if you add up all the starts from the guys who started in 2022, right? 13 games, 5 offensive linemen, you get 65. So when you're losing Douglas, Gwen, Wanham, you keep going down the list, 50%. So being able to replace that, I mean, you saw what South Carolina went through. You saw the growing pains. Now, if you're already going to go through growing pains, and then you lose your starting left tackle, and then you lose your right tackle week 1, never mind the other injuries that took place throughout the season sprinkled in, that's a recipe for disaster. I don't care which team you are. That's a recipe for disaster. So, look, no one's trying to make excuses for what took place this season because South Carolina certainly had their woes in many areas this past season. However, already going into a season where you knew South Carolina's offensive line was already a big giant question mark on it. To lose your starting left tackle in the spring game, to be done for the year in the spring game. Essentially, what that did is that negated any positivity that you were able to create with your offensive line in the spring, simply because everything you worked on included Nichols at left tackle. And now you go into the season, and now you're starting to move guys around because you didn't have that depth. You didn't have that comfortability to be able to slide someone in to left tackle. So you're already doing that. And then you lose your right tackle in the first game of the season. And now at that point, it's a Chinese fire drill. So I bring these things up because, again, South Carolina's offensive line, they went through a lot of issues last year. A lot of issues. I thought they did a great job of being able to bounce back. I thought they had some good games last season, all things considered. But it was always going to be a weakness. It was always going to be a weakness. Having said all that, looking ahead to this year, looking at what South Carolina has, the biggest thing to me they have is they have a lot of experience. They have a lot of experience. And on top of that, they have a lot of talent too. I shared my week 1 starting 5 in this story, and we can just agree to disagree. But I think my whole point when you look at this, and I'm sure this is where we can all agree, whether you agree on the starting 5 or not, South Carolina has so much talent and so much depth that even if you disagree with one of these players being on this starting 5, that you have the ability to create a lot of competition at a lot of positions. So at left tackle, at least as of right now, things can change, right? You pray to God, no injuries. I have Big Tree, Luedecke and Babalade as of today. Vershawn Lee at left guard, a position where he has more experience than any other Gamecock on this roster. At center, I have the transfer from North Carolina Central, the 2023 MEAC Offensive Lineman of the Year, an FCS preseason All-American, and a 2024 Reese's Senior Bowl watch list player. Torricelli Simpkins started 12 games this past season, 6'5", 320. He has experience in 34 games in his college career. At right guard, the freshman All-American, Trevon Baugh. And then at right tackle, I think the right tackle position is the most intriguing. I think both tackle positions you could talk about, but the right tackle one more than anything. Right now, who I have at right tackle is Casey Henry. Injuries plagued Henry from the start of to the finish, right? From the start to finish in 2023. He appeared in just 2 games in what was his redshirt freshman season. He was the projected week 1 starter. Or the projected starter throughout the course of the season. He started week 1 at right tackle. And then, unfortunately, injuries prevented him from playing. And then he came back a little bit during that Jacksonville State game, but it wasn't himself. One person I could really see pushing him at that spot at right tackle is someone that's coming back for another season. Is Tyshawn Wanamaker. Last year, appeared in 10 games, 4 starts at right tackle, 30 career games under his belt. So I bring up those players, and I'm sure there's some comments, and I'm going to head on over and check out what some of you guys are saying. But here's the interesting part. Let's say that is the starting 5, okay? Let's say that is the starting 5. You have some talented players coming in, right? Josiah Thompson, you have a lot of talented players coming in. Marquis Anderson, who was banged up last season, right? He could factor in there. He could push a guy like Lee. But when I look at it, and here's the interesting part. between Wanamaker, Jones, right? Fugar, and Moore. Those four have combined to play in 90 collegiate games. So here's my point. If you don't agree with my starting five, which is okay, and this isn't to say that this is what it's going to be. I mean, we're talking about, projecting an offensive line in January. I mean, it's literally throwing darts in the dark here. But you have so much experience behind those guys. God forbid anyone gets hurt. And as we've said many, many times before, many of you already understand this. When we're talking about the offensive line, it's not always about putting the five best out there. It's the five that play the best together, that are the most in sync with one another. That's why I went with those five. I want to hear what some of you guys have to say. Let's see. Talking about the offensive line. Clint mentioned Wanamaker has to gain weight. Cocky Joe says Marquis Anderson will be starting. Cocky, where do you have him? Let me know. Because again, we're not going to agree on I'm sure we're not going to agree on the starting five. Not everyone's going to agree with it. But my whole point is they're just so deep with talent. I would love to see Marquis Anderson crack it. WJM 401 says definitely wasted. Let me know who you're talking about, WJM. Craig Godwin says just like Thompson. I think what people need to remember about Thompson, and Craig, I'm not saying you're specifically saying this, but I'm sure some people saw my list and now they're going to start wondering about the offensive lineup of Thompson. Where is he going to factor in? He's a true freshman. Obviously, last year, having to play a Luedecke and Babalade and Big Tree, those were unique circumstances, to say the least, because of injuries. Both those players gained plenty of experience last year. Plenty of experience. Now, in a perfect world, do you want to have to play two true freshmen and start two true freshmen as much as you did? Certainly not. Babalade appeared in 11 games, 9 starts as a true freshman. Trevon Baugh, 11 games, made 8 starts. In a perfect world, you don't start two true freshmen. You don't. There's always going to be outliers. There's always going to be things as to, okay, maybe this player can play right away. But in the offensive line, typically you don't see that, especially when you have a lot of talent. That's not to say Thompson can't crack the starting five. At this point, I'm not going to make any assumptions. I think I've seen some people throw just Dylan Stewart instantly into the starting lineup. It's like, pump the brakes a little bit. Now, Dylan Stewart, out of anyone coming in here, no disrespect to Josiah Thompson. I'd even go back to last year's class, no disrespect to Nick Harbor. But out of any freshman in the last couple of years, he's probably the most ready. But still, I'm not going to just throw someone into the starting mix right away when they're a true freshman. We just haven't seen them at this level yet. This isn't high school, okay? Again, Dylan Stewart, he's going to be probably playing on a different level, especially as the season goes on. Once he's able to figure out the speed and he's going to be able to get in here early, he's going to be able to figure things out quickly. That's not going to surprise me. But as of right now, I'm going to pump the brakes on certain freshmen. But when you look at the depth that they have at the offensive line position, my goodness. And I've had conversations with some former Gamecocks, specifically Gamecock offensive linemen, and they wonder if you could see a guy like Tree move into the guard position at some point, simply because if they feel confident about having Josiah Thompson being their left tackle in the future, right? 2025, 2026, it could help things in terms of being able to, they feel like, okay, maybe he could be a better fit here. Those are things, too, that could happen, right? You could have someone get bumped down in the offensive line from a tackle to a guard position. But that's what I have for my five. Let me know what you guys think. Bottom line is this. They have a lot of talent. A lot of talent. And I think that's the beauty of where South Carolina stands today when you're talking about what's going on with USC's offensive line. Robert Short asks, is it a thought that Luedecke is not going to cut it? His issue last year, and I think, Clint, you mentioned it, being banged up a little bit. I think the problem is, like you said, the injury bug played a role with him last year. But I think, too, I mean, you're talking about a very talented offensive line. That's not to say Brubaker can't come in here and compete. I think that's the thing. I mean, that's the beauty of it, right? Any position you're talking about, not just the offensive line, but any position, you're talking about being able to create so much competition that it is difficult to figure out, okay, who's your starting five going to be? And behind that starting five, who's your backups in a lot of these roles? I mean, this is the deepest I've seen South Carolina's offensive line room in the 8 seasons going on 9 years that I've been here. I think it's going to be fascinating to see how things shape up in a lot of ways. Travis says, can't overlook Shivers. I love what Shivers did last season, especially as the season went on, from talking to people. We didn't get to see it in games, but from talking to people and hearing some of the things he was able to do, they're very high on Shivers. I thought he would have appeared in some more games down the stretch, especially at that right tackle position. Didn't happen. But Travis, I'm glad you brought up Shivers because I agree. I think I actually put that in the story. Don't overlook Shivers. Craig Aggs, I hope Marquis can start at one of the guard spots. I think if you look at it right now, Craig, right? If you look at Marquis, and Marquis is one of those guards I see, Cocky say, right tackle Anderson. I have him as a guard. Coming out of high school, he was a guard. That's not to say that they might be thinking about potentially that, but I think he'll be a guard. You're not going to move, or I'd be very surprised. You're not going to move someone like Trevon Baugh. So if you're not going to move someone like Trevon Baugh or guard, and let's just say for the sake of conversation, Simpkins is your center, then left guard would be that other position. Vershawn Lee, who has experience of playing right tackle, again, you could always put a guy like Anderson at left guard and then bump Vershawn down there if you feel comfortable enough and confident enough in Vershawn. But Vershawn has played guard, he's played tackle, and he's also played center. Very versatile. And being able to have a player like Vershawn gives you that flexibility, because if you feel like, man, Marquis Anderson's doing some really good things in practice, man, he had a really good spring, and you want to put him on the field, and you feel confident enough of putting Vershawn at a different position outside of guard, it's going to allow you to do that. So a good problem to have. And as it is with any team that has good depth, and as we're talking here today about South Carolina, this is good depth on paper, right? We're going to have to wait and see how some of this stuff pans out once we get to spring ball. But they have a lot of depth right now. A lot of depth. Cocky Joe says right tackle Anderson. Clint says Anderson will be one of the guards. Travis adds, Thompson is good enough, in my opinion, that he can compete at right tackle. His footwork may be the best among our tackles. I think that would be good, too, to see how he's able to play both, not just left tackle, which he has experience of playing, but right tackle as well. Because it doesn't only give you that flexibility from a Gamecock standpoint, it helps the player out too, right? I mean, I know fans don't necessarily want to hear some of this, but I mean, when you're talking about trying to have a higher ceiling from a draft standpoint, versatility is going to help you out a lot. So being able to prove that you can play both right tackle as well as left tackle can help out someone like Thompson. So I think he'll get work at both positions, no question. Nick Bob says, how early do Pringle, Thompson, and Franks get playing time on the offensive line? If I had to take a stab at it, Nick, I would say certainly, and it's not like I'm breaking a story here as far as to say, this isn't like Watergate, but Thompson, then I could see Pringle, and then I could see Franks as far as, okay, who could see playing. And that's just an early projection, right? You're just projection. That's where I can see things right now, just based off of the size, based off of the speed, based off of some of the things we've seen on tape. That's not to say that a guy like Franks can't come in here and beat out both those, but that's just where I see things right now. Clint, I'm interested to see where Simpkins plays. I think Simpkins will play center Cedric goes, Simpkins will start. I can see him playing center simply because he did a lot of good things. And I know it's a different level. I totally get that. Totally get that. But when you're on a watch list for the Reese's Senior Bowl, that tells you everything you need to know about this young man. That's why I can't see him coming in here and not starting. As Cedric said, he'll start, and I think it will be at that center position. Now, here's the thing. For the sake of conversation, we talked about Marquis Anderson, right? Play here. Do they feel, and this is what Nick Gargiulo was able to give South Carolina last year, because Gargiulo had the ability of playing multiple positions on the offensive line, they were able to put Vershawn at center first. Injuries happen. They move some guys down. They put Gargiulo at center. I shared this before in Gamecock Central during the last game against Clemson. I shared this, that Gargiulo was so banged up. I mean, he had a busted hand. The fact that he was able to grip a football, for crying out loud, he can snap it, was a miracle. And because of how banged up South Carolina's offensive line room was, from talking to people, he still felt like he gave him the best option. And a lot of people agreed with that. The people that I talked to. That goes to show you how much they didn't have that depth on the offensive line. That shouldn't be the issue next season. Again, that's not to say everything's going to be all sunshine and rainbows with the offensive line next year. Let's not get this misconstrued. No, I'm not saying that. There could be some growing pains, certainly, especially when you have a young quarterback back there. But at the same time, too, I really like where they're at right now. And for a guy like Sellers, for a guy like Reno, whoever they have at quarterback out there, the offensive line is going to have to make them look good. They're going to have to do everything they can to make them look good. It's the complete opposite of what we saw from a year ago, where Spencer Rattler, as offensive coordinator Dal Loggins would say, he's kind of like spaghetti sauce. He can cover things up, right? And what I meant by that is he's able to cover some of the things that aren't going so well for the offense, that he can, make things look good. As we would describe it, as he's like makeup. He's able to cover up some of those blemishes. Roles are reversed this year, this upcoming year in 2024. Offensive line is going to have to cover up some of those blemishes because you have a young quarterback out there, regardless, again, who that week one starter is. JM41 says, wasted Spencer at quarterback due to the O-line issues. It's part of football, unfortunately. Part of football, unfortunately. Jay Diz, any word on Coach Cooley? He would be a smart hire for the offense. We'll come back to that one in a little bit, Jay Diz. Appreciate you being back on here. Eric says, who are your backups across the offensive line? That's Eric, I think the problem with that, and I'm not trying to get away from what you're asking, I think it's just tough. Because let's put it this way. If you have one of those 5 starters I just mentioned, and God forbid someone went down at one of those positions, you cross-train with a lot of play. You cross-train with practically all your offensive linemen. And that's something Lonnie Teasley and we talked about last season before the start of the year, that you're constantly cross-training your offensive linemen. In the event that someone goes down, certainly in a perfect world, you just insert one player, right? But depending on who goes down, that can change things. Now, I don't like to say from an injury standpoint, right? Because I'm trying to make sure we avoid that. So let's just say someone's suspended, right? Someone's not able to play. If I'm saying that Simpkins is your week 1 starter at center, right? That's what I'm predicting. If Simpkins isn't available week 1, they might feel like, and again, this is just for the sake of conversation, Vershawn Lee is their best bet. Vershawn slides down to center. Are you able just to plug someone in at guard? Is that Marquis Anderson? Is that someone else? Or are you going to have to shuffle some things around the offensive line? Again, in a perfect world, it's just you insert one person for one, right? But it all depends who gets hurt, who isn't available on the offensive line, if that is the case. So I think that's why it gets a little tricky, because I don't think it's as simple as saying, all right, here's your starting 5 and here are their backups. Because if someone goes down, someone's not available, it doesn't work out always as, all right, left tackle goes down. All right, the next guy's in. Or is there someone on the starting line that they feel like gives them the best option if said player goes down, where they can slide them over and then you insert someone in that position, if that makes sense. God Loves Comics says, hey, Mike, in the teaser video, Beamer told the team we're not going to do things the same way as last year. Any thoughts what we could change? I think they need to change practice to mitigate some of the injuries. I think, and this is just my experience of going through a coaching change and being part of teams in the past where maybe things didn't go well a certain year and you're trying to figure out what you can do right. It's the little things, right? And I know that sounds like, oh, gee, great answer there, Bear Bryant. No, but it's the little things of how you do things, right? How you practice, how you the fundamentals, the little things as far as the approach. Is it more hands-on, from a film standpoint and the teachings and the ways that you're trying to get your message across the players? Do you have to be more hands-on? I mean, it's just, think of it like from a classroom standpoint, right? You have some people that are visual learners, and then you have some people that need to be able to see it more. So I share that because sometimes you might need more walkthrough time. You might need to go out there. You might not necessarily have a football, but you're doing more walkthrough stuff because from a player standpoint, some players from a visual standpoint, when they're actually there and they're actually on a field or, could be a basketball court, wherever, right? And you're actually out there and you're lined up, it helps them out more opposed to looking at a slideshow, right? Looking at a PowerPoint and going through it that way. So I think that's the thing I took away from that. As far as injuries go, I mean, the way college football is, I feel like it's a tricky situation. And I've said this before. I think this was an issue not just for South Carolina, but you saw it a lot with the SEC. You saw it with a lot of teams throughout college football, especially at the beginning of the year, because of so many rules that have changed college football in the sense of how fall camp is operated, where you're not having as many days to have full contact practice. It's really cut back. There's days off now, right? I think what's happening now more than ever, you're seeing a lot of teams develop a lot of bad habits because they're not able to go out there and practice tackling the way that we once did. Now, having said all that, we can get in back and forth like, well, there was a lot of head injuries. There's a lot of this. There's a lot of that. I understand that. And I think we've come a long way with continuing to learn about the brain and how, continuing to do certain things from a football standpoint, practice games, how it can have an impact when we're talking about CTE and other injuries as a whole. But I also think, too, if you're not practicing certain things enough, your body naturally is not going to be able to respond the same way when you take certain hits, when you take certain blows. And I'm not saying specifically to the head. I'm talking about being able to get those repetitions so that your body understands, right? I mean, we talk about it all the time from a football standpoint. We'd always say, it's not practice makes perfect. It's perfect practice makes permanent. And how you do things, you're going to develop habits so that when you go out there on the field, it's muscle memory. You understand exactly what you have to do. Now, we all know with anything in life, you can practice a million times, but as Mike Tyson once said, everyone has a game plan until you get punched in the face. It's not always going to go the way that you had, hoped for, right? But if you continue to practice over and over, you're going to understand how to handle situations in a certain manner. So I say those things because I think the way they go about practice, yes, it was very physical from talking to a lot of players, especially on Tuesdays. Do they change things up a little bit? They might, but at the same time, too, and you don't have to go out there and just, ram heads for 2 hours straight every single day. That's not what I'm saying here. There's a lot of programs that I've seen. I've been at different practices where they do things a certain way and they're still able to be very successful. Very successful. But I think it's understanding how can we adjust to some of those things that we talked about while still being able to get the most out of our players so that once they go in the field, Never mind the injuries that we're talking about, but just from a execution standpoint, they're going to be ready to go. Because I think you see that with some teams. I think you truly do in this era of college football. Let's see. Talking Tech with Dinks the same. I can see Marquis holding down the right guard spot. Good problem to have. Also for you Talking Tech, and I know you may have, we're a couple minutes behind now, so you may have said this, but if you do have at that right guard position, and again, this is what I just wrote down based on what we saw last year, and if you do have Trevon Bott right guard, do you put Marquis in that spot and move Bott to a different position? Or do you don't have Bott, who was a All-American as a freshman this past season, do you not have him on the starting five? I'm not being a wise guy, I'm asking. Because, like we've been talking about, it's a good problem to have. It's a great problem to have, honestly. Clint mentions Babalade would be a better fit at guard. Clint also adds, don't forget Trey Jones. Yeah, mention Jones. I mentioned 4 of the guys, right? I mentioned when you look at the fact that, because none of these guys, at least right now, I have in my starting 5. That's not to say that they're not talented enough, because I think Wanamaker in particular is someone to keep a very close eye on at right tackle behind Henry right now. But Wanamaker, Jones, Fugar, and Moore, between the 4 of them, they've appeared in 90 collegiate football games. 90. And I don't have any of those guys on the starting 5 right now. But that's just the reality of it. Like, you have some talent on this offensive line. There's going to be some guys that have come back for a 5th year, 6th year that might not crack the starting 5 simply because you have a lot of talent. Now, a guy like Jones, he's done a lot of good things at guard. See, a guy like Wanamaker, he's done a lot of good things at tackle. Who's going to be the odd man out in a lot of these positions? There's going to be some great competition on the offensive line. Some great competition. Travis, Marquis should move to center. You're not the only one that has mentioned that to me, Travis. A former Gamecock offensive lineman who I spoke with yesterday, he brought that up. And while Marquis might not have the same amount of experience in comparison to a guy like Simpkins or a guy like Vershawn Lee, certainly at the college level, if he's talented enough and you want to find a way to get someone on the field, then you cross-train him with that position. But again, I'm very high on Simpkins being the center, but that's not to say, like you said, if Marquis is talented enough, you make some things move around. You're able to figure things out to make sure that you get everyone out there. Thompson's probably the most talented guy on the entire offensive line. As far from a projection standpoint, I would agree with that. Right now, I think that's a bold statement, Clint. I think that's a bold statement. Watching the Senior Bowl the other day, there's certainly some things he can clean up, and I think he's going to come along nicely. But he's a freshman. It's gonna take some time for some of these guys. I think that's the other thing we got to remember is that some of these guys that are coming in here, they're going to redshirt. Clint mentions, Franks and Pringles will probably redshirt most likely. I mean, guys are going to redshirt. It's college football, right? I mean, this isn't a video game. Not every freshman is going to come in here. More times than not, a freshman is not going to be a difference maker their first year. That's just the reality of it, especially, knock on wood, if you're able to stay healthy. And that's not to say Thompson can't be a difference maker. My whole point being is, with the depth, talent that they have coming in here, expectations for some of these players, like we talked about with Nick Harbor last year, right? I think a lot of people, Nick Harbor's coming out here, man, like pump the brakes. Obviously his case was a little different, right? Going from a tight end / DN in high school to learning a new position, wide receiver. But even a guy like Sellers, it's like I tell people, pump the brakes. Travis Edwards, Pringle and Franks are about 2 years away. I would agree with that. And that's okay. That's okay to say with some of these players. It's okay. It's not a negative thing. These are freshmen we're talking about. Pringle needs to shed some of that bad high school weight. I think with a lot of these high school players, specifically when you talk about offensive linemen, that baby fat All right. I know some PC people will get all upset because you say fat, but some of that baby fat that you shed and turn into muscle when you get to a college standpoint, because now you're with a strength and conditioning coach, and no disrespect to the strength and conditioning coaches out there from the high school ranks, especially the ones that I know in the state of South Carolina. But once you get into a college weightlifting program, you're able to turn that fat into muscle. And, as some of you know out there, muscle weighs more than fat. So don't be surprised to even see some of those weights jump up from a good standpoint once they're able to get into these weightlifting programs. James goes, it was noted that Thompson was going to need to put on weight before next season. He weighed at 265 in the All-American game. Yeah, again, some of the stuff that we're talking about, being able to put some of that good weight on, even when you're an offensive lineman. Clint says, I think Simpkins at center gives you more versatility with other guys. I agree, Clint, with that. Bill says, could Mazio start at wide receiver? We'll have an opportunity simply because you don't have a lot of experience at a lot of the wide receiver positions, not just experience. When I say experience, I'm talking about experience here at South Carolina. Bringing in some of the transfer players in a perfect world, yeah, every one of those guys is going to come in here and make an impact. But as we've seen over the last couple of years with any position, it's not always going to work out that way. Not every transfer that comes into South Carolina is going to be a difference maker. I mean, that's just the reality of it. So I say that because with Mazio, I think he's someone that he could be. Here's the thing that I like about Mazio, and I've said this before in the past. Mazio does a lot of things that you don't see from high school wide receivers. He understands route running in a way that reminds me of what you would see from some of these college guys from their freshman year, even like sophomores. And what I mean by that is he understands that we demonstrated a video. We put it out, I want to say it was last summer, him running I'm trying to remember the exact route that he ran. I don't know if it was a post corner. I'll have to go back and look at it. But he ran a route where he understood exactly what he was trying to do to the defensive back. Because at the high school level, I feel like one of the challenges for high school players when they come to college is they're just so damn talented that they're able to get away with a lot of bad habits just naturally because they're so good. They're just naturally so talented that they use their speed. They're good catchers, right? All that kind of stuff, but they don't truly understand what they're doing. So I say that because with a guy like Mazio, it's not just, okay, my route is a post corner. It's understanding exactly when to make a certain cut, how to make it, and he's good enough to do the rest. So that's why if Mazio is able to separate himself from some of these other freshmen coming in here, and perhaps some of the guys that are already on the roster, I think a lot of it will have to do with just his knowledge. Now, certainly the speed of the game, things are going to be different. Being able to build a rapport with his quarterbacks, that's going to be important. But I think he's someone that can certainly be a difference maker as far as competing for, because you're talking about the starting. When I say starting six, they're looking for a 6 on that depth chart from a wide receiver standpoint. I could see him being in that 6, 5. I mean, we could sit here and get into, okay, who's your top 6 right now? I don't want to say something where it comes back. It's like, well, Mike, you said this guy. But I could see him competing for one of those 6 or 5 spots. Having said that, I also think there's guys to keep an eye on that didn't really make an impact as much last year, or maybe flashed a little bit, or didn't really play at all because of injuries or for whatever reason. Tyson Russell, I've mentioned Russell before. I really like some of the things that he demonstrated last year as a freshman. That's someone I would keep an eye on. I also think, too, with a guy like Elijah Caldwell, who had some injuries early on, I think that's another player to keep an eye on, too. Because when you look at South Carolina's roster, when you're talking about some of these wide receivers that will be coming back next season, right? One thing that they're going to be really hurting for, outside, of course, with Nicholas Harbor, is that they don't have the size that you would probably have liked to see at the wide receiver position. So when you look at it, as far as, okay, who can be a difference maker at wide receiver, and I'm looking at some of the guys right now, Elijah Caldwell, 6'1", 191. CJ Adams is coming back, of course, right? Redshirt freshman last season. There's going to be someone that has to step up. There's going to be someone that has to step up in that room. And I'm also interested to see some of these wide receivers who, I look at a guy like Kelton Henderson. How do some of these guys who were freshmen last year that maybe didn't have the weight on them, how do they look after an offseason? I'm looking at some of the comments here. Will says, it's a pleasure having you cover my favorite team, Mike. You do a great job. Oh, thank you, Will. Appreciate that. Clint says, that was definitely a projection, Mike. He'll have to gain a good 30 pounds before he's truly ready. I'm sure you're talking about the offensive line, which we were talking about. Craig mentions about Mazio as I'm going down the list trying to get caught up, so I apologize skipping some of the comments. We're going to wrap up the show in a little bit. Longer show today. It's like therapeutic for me today. As many of you know I'm a New Englander. Wearing my Belichick Christmas sweater today with the news with Belichick parting ways and Patriots parting ways with Bill Belichick. Let's see. Jay Diz says Mazio can block well. Dude is going to be playing early. He's in a good situation right now. We're talking about the lack of proven talent in that wide receiver room. Again, Luke Doty, 13 receptions last year. That is the most receptions you have coming back in that room. Not talking about transfers, but in that room from a year ago. Number 2, Nick Harbor, who had 12. Will again says, Mazio is good at competitive catches despite his height. Yeah, throwing those balls up in 50-50 situations. And you look at a lot of teams in a college football standpoint, you see it in the NFL too. But you saw Spencer throw a lot of those 50-50 balls up with Xavier Legette. And the good wide receivers out there, they turn it into more of a 70-30, right? If not a 60-40. So with Mazio, I think he's going to put some good weight on this upcoming year. I can only imagine what he's going to look like a year from now. But it's something to keep an eye on for sure. Let's see what else we have here. God loves comics. For end zone fade routes, you look to Josh Simon or Brady Hunt. That's the other thing, too. And I'm glad you brought him up. God loves comics. I've said this before. By having a guy like Josh Simon to go along with a guy like Brady Hunt, who, as I've shared before, and this is no disrespect to Hayden Hurst, because I had the opportunity to cover Hayden during his time at South Carolina. And when I watched the film, and I say no disrespect to Hayden Hurst, is simply because with Brady, even though he was on the watch list last year for tight end of the year, before unfortunately getting hurt, the thing with Brady is he reminds me a lot of Hayden in the sense that he has the size, very similar actually in size with the height and weight. He's got some speed. I think he runs around that same 40 time that Hayden runs. He's someone that if he can be physical from a blocking standpoint to go along with Josh Simon, it's going to allow South Carolina to take some of that pressure away from their wide receiver room. Simply because if you have two tight ends who, number one, can be physical from a blocking standpoint, which we saw from Josh Simon. We saw it going back to fall camp, for crying out loud. And as I've said many times before in the past, Josh had to block more, especially early on in the year. We got to see him more as a pass catcher towards the end of the season for two reasons. One, Trey Knox was banged up a little bit, right? Going back to the start of the season, before in preseason camp, got hurt again towards the end of the year. But Josh had to also help out from a blocking standpoint because of how beat up the offensive line was, because he's so damn good when it comes to blocking. It's very physical. So having Josh out there to help out with the offensive linemen, what's going to happen? Well, if your attention is going to be shifted to blocking, you're not going to have as many opportunities to catch the football. I think we'll see Josh have more opportunities to catch it. I think he'll have more receptions this year, more yards, more touchdowns, all that fun stuff. But I also think Brady Hunt, as God Loves Comics mentions, I think he'll also be someone to make an impact. Nick mentions, have you got any information about Robbie Ashford or any portal quarterback prospects? Robbie's another guy that we're continuing to keep an eye on. That's the name that I just keep being told to watch. I know my colleague Chris Clark put something out there, I think it was yesterday or even a couple of days ago. He may have mentioned something extra yesterday. That's the name to keep an eye on right now. And for those of you who don't know who we're talking about with Robbie Ashford, he was at Auburn. And we will share this so you guys can see exactly who I'm talking about. This is the quarterback that we've been told to keep an eye on for South Carolina. Part of the 2019 class. Oregon, Auburn. Now, as far as what he's done, statistically speaking, he saw more of his playing time at Auburn. Played in 12 games in 2022. Played in 10 games this past season. So 22 games played at Auburn, 12 touchdown passes. 9 touchdown passes, 12 rushing touchdowns. 9 interceptions, threw for over 1,700 yards. Completion rate, 49%. So that is the one that we're keeping an eye on right now as far as scholarship quarterbacks who South Carolina could be bringing in. God Loves Comics. Auburn sent Oregon Bo Nix, and Oregon sent back Robbie Ashford. So that's kind of what we're looking at right now. Well, folks, appreciate you tuning in. It's been a fun one. If you missed any of our show today, head on over to the Gamecock Central YouTube page where you can watch this show in its entirety. Or if you're a podcast listener, head on over to the Gamecock Central Podcast Network where you can watch and listen, depending on where you're going to be paying attention to. You can watch and listen to both these shows for free. Subscribe today to both for free so that you don't miss any Gamecock Central content, especially on the video side of things where we're constantly updating you guys with videos. Also see some press conferences if you miss it, and some more Gamecock Central original content. Also, before we wrap things up today, I want to thank our sponsors. You see that Clint Hammond tag, which is always above us on these GC Live shows. Clint has been a longtime supporter of Gamecock Central, but he's also been a longtime sponsor of GC Live. If you're in the process of purchasing a home right now, you understand that the market still, it's getting a little bit better. Fingers crossed sooner rather than later. The market still right now is a little tricky. Trying to purchase a home, you know that it's not necessarily easy, but Clint and his team, he can make that process much easier for you, the same way he did for former Gamecock quarterback Perry Orth and his wife Shannon, as well as our very own Wes Mitchell. Give him a call, 803-771-6933. And today's show is also brought to you by our good friends over at Liberty Tax. Tax season is right around the corner, and if you're like me, you're trying to start to get things in order. You're trying to make that process much easier. Well, give the folks over at Liberty Tax a call. Larry and his team do an outstanding job so that you can overcome taxiety. Overcome taxiety this tax season by giving Liberty Tax a call. That is 803-462-5576. Appreciate you guys. One last comment for Craig. Ashford can fly, but Loggins would have to really work with him throwing the ball. You can say that about a lot of guys, though, too. I know people don't want to hear that. You can say the same thing, too, about Sellers. Sellers got a cannon. I think it's some of those shorter passes. You talk to people, he needs to work on more than anything. Cocky Joe, appreciate that. God Loves Comment. Cocky Joe says, thanks, Mike. Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys, for tuning in today. Be sure to catch Chris and Wes. They'll be on tomorrow, I believe, and hopefully by then, if not beginning of next week, South Carolina will have their next running back coach. Be sure to follow Gamecock Central for the latest on that. We'll give you updates on that, as well as some other things to pay attention to, because with Jody Wright, congratulations to Coach Wright, Jody Wright becoming the head coach at Murray State, South Carolina right now, they're trying to fill their tight end position. And as some of you guys may notice, with Cooley coming in here, they haven't specifically said that he's going to be the tight ends coach. So having said that, what I can tell you is there could be a couple more moving pieces on South Carolina's staff. So pay attention to Gamecock Central to know more about what I am talking about. Have yourself a good rest of your Thursday. Enjoy the weekend. Stay dry out there. And thank you for tuning in today to GC Live Afternoon Drive.